Good night, friend. Get comfortable wherever you are right now. Pull the blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop, and just breathe for a moment. Tonight we're going to talk about something that most history books never bothered to write down, because the people who did it were considered too ordinary, too domestic, too housewifely to deserve a chapter. We are going to talk about the secret money tricks that 1950s housewives knew, how they managed household finances on tight budgets, stretched $1 further than anyone thought possible, quietly built small savings that no one ever acknowledged, and ran economic systems inside their own kitchens that were every bit as sophisticated as anything happening in the offices their husbands drove off to every morning. And here is the thing that makes this story truly remarkable. Many of these women had no legal access to their own bank account, no credit card in their name, no financial identity that existed separately from their husbands. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, a woman could be denied a loan simply for being a woman. Before that, before the slow, grinding legal changes of the 1960s and early 1970s, a married woman in America was in many respects economically invisible. She could not open a line of credit without her husband's signature. She could not own property in her name in many states. Her wages, if she earned any, were considered by law to belong to her husband. And yet, inside those limitations, inside that narrow economic cage, these women built something. They saved. They strategized. They negotiated. They found angles nobody was looking for because nobody thought to look. They ran household economies with a precision and a creativity that a business school professor might honestly admire if they ever took the time to study them carefully, which mostly they did not. So tonight, we are going to count down 30 of the most ingenious, most human, most quietly brilliant financial strategies that women in the 1950s used to manage money, build small fortunes, and maintain a kind of economic dignity that the era officially told them they were not entitled to. Some of these you may have heard whispered about. Some will genuinely surprise you. And a few of them, I think, are going to stay with you long after you fall asleep. If this kind of storytelling feels like your kind of company late at night, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps, and it means more of these stories get told. But settle in first. There is no hurry. Tonight we have all the time in the world. Now. Let us go back. Let us go all the way back to a kitchen in 1953. The linoleum floor is clean because she mopped it this morning. The refrigerator hums in the corner, a pale green colour because that was the fashionable shade that year. On the counter there is a percolator, a ceramic canister set labelled flour, sugar, coffee, tea, and tucked at the back. Behind the coffee canister, a small glass jar. Nothing fancy, just an old pickle jar with a metal lid, the label soaked off, and the glass wiped clean. Inside that jar are folded bills, $1 here, $1.50 there. Some weeks only 50 cents, some weeks nothing at all, because there was nothing left to skim. But the jar is there, it is always there, and she tends to it the way another woman might tend a garden, with patience, with consistency, and with the private knowledge that it belongs to her in a way that almost nothing else in this house legally does. That jar is number 30 on our list, and it is where every great financial story of the 1950s housewife begins. Not with some dramatic scheme or complicated arrangement, but with a jar. With the simplest possible act of saving something quietly every week, without explaining why. The economics of that jar require a bit of context to fully appreciate. A household in the early 1950s might run on a weekly budget of somewhere between $30 and $60, depending on where they lived and how much the husband brought home. That covered groceries, utilities, clothing, household supplies, and any unexpected expenses. The husband typically handed over a set amount of cash each week, what was called the housekeeping money, and she was expected to run the household on that amount. No questions, no accounting, no negotiation. He gave her the money, she made it work, and the details were entirely her domain, which meant the details were also her opportunity. Because when you are the only person who knows what a pound of ground beef costs, and what the dry cleaner charges, and how much the children's shoes ran last month, you have a kind of information advantage that is genuinely powerful, even inside a system that officially gives you nothing. She knew the prices, she knew the margins, she knew which weeks were lean and which had a little room, and over time she learned how to find that room deliberately. The pickle jar was the physical home for what economists would later call discretionary savings, though that language was never used in any kitchen I have ever read about. She simply called it her little bit, or her extra, or in some households it had no name at all because giving it a name would have made it too real, too visible, too much of a thing that someone might ask about. It lived behind the coffee canister, because the coffee canister was the last thing anyone moved. It lived in the kitchen because the kitchen was her room, the one place in the house where she had complete authority and where her husband would no more rummage through the cabinets than he would reorganize her sewing basket. Some women used something other than a jar. Some preferred an envelope tucked inside the pages of a cookbook that no one else ever opened. Some used a small cloth pouch stitched into the lining of a winter coat that hung in the closet 9 months of the year. Some simply folded bills flat and pressed them into the bottom of the flour canister, where they sat beneath the daily drift of flour dust, invisible and completely safe. The container was almost beside the point. What mattered was the consistency. $1 this week, $1 next week, 50 cents the week after if things were tight. Over the course of a year, those small amounts added up to something real. Over the course of 5 or 10 years, they added up to something significant. And now number 29, which is the strategy that funded the jar in the first place, and which most husbands saw operating every single week without ever once understanding what they were looking at. She came home from the grocery store with change, not always much, sometimes only a few coins, but she came home with change because she had budgeted the grocery run the night before, down to the approximate cent, and she had left herself a small margin. He gave her, say, $12 for the week's groceries. She knew from careful attention and long practice that she could feed the family on $10.75 if she was strategic about it. So she came home with $1.25. She put $1 in the jar. The 25 cents went back into the kitchen budget for next week. And the following week she started with a small advantage, which she used to create another small surplus, which went into the jar. He never asked about the change. It never occurred to him to ask about the change. In his understanding, she had gone to the grocery store with $12 and bought $12 worth of groceries. The fact that she had done it for less was simply competence, and competence was expected of her. He would no more question the change than he would ask the bank teller to explain how they balanced the till. It was her job. She was good at it. The details were not his concern. This grocery skimming, as some historians have called it, was not considered deception by the women who practiced it. It was considered arithmetic. She had been given a job, she had done that job efficiently, and the efficiency created a surplus that was hers by any reasonable logic. The fact that the law and the culture of the time would have disagreed with that reasoning is exactly why the jar existed behind the coffee canister, instead of in a savings account at the bank downtown. Number 28 takes us out of the kitchen and into the grocery store itself, because there was a whole set of strategies that happened before she ever came home with that change. And this one, I think, is the kind of thing that looks like simple shopping until you understand the intelligence operating underneath it. She kept a price book. Not every woman called it that. Some called it the grocery list. Some called it just their notes. But what it functionally was is a small notebook. Sometimes just a few folded pages slipped into the front flap of a handbag, where she tracked the regular price of every item she bought routinely. Flour, sugar, coffee, lard, salt pork, canned tomatoes, soap powder. Every week she noted what she paid, and gradually she built up a picture of the actual price behavior of the things her family depended on. She knew that coffee had been 39 cents a can 3 weeks ago, and was now 43 cents, and would probably go back down when the Acme ran their monthly special. She knew that ground beef was cheaper on Thursdays than on Saturdays, because the butcher got his delivery Wednesday evenings and wanted to move it fresh. She knew that the generic flour in the plain white bag was identical to the brand name flour in the printed bag and cost 14 cents less. This was market intelligence, gathered through simple observation and careful record-keeping over months and years, and she used it to buy things at the right time rather than the convenient time, to stock up when prices were low and hold back when they were high, to build a small pantry buffer that smoothed out the week-to-week variation in prices and availability. Husbands of this era generally knew almost nothing about grocery prices. They had no reason to know. She handled the food, she handled the shopping. In surveys from the early 1950s, men routinely guessed the price of basic staples at figures significantly higher than the actual price, which means that in many households the weekly grocery budget her husband gave her was calculated based on his inflated guesses of what things cost, and she was actually doing it for less, consistently, because she knew the real numbers and he did not. The gap between his guess and her reality was, in a very direct sense, how the jar got funded. Let us stay in the grocery store for a moment, because number 27 is one of my favorite strategies in the entire list, and it happened right there in the produce aisle. She learnt which items were negotiable. This sounds strange to modern ears because we live in a world of fixed retail prices and barcode scanners, but in a 1950s grocery store, and especially in the smaller neighborhood grocers that still existed alongside the new supermarkets, there was a certain amount of flexibility if you knew how to ask for it. Produce that was getting a little soft had to move. The butcher had cuts that were perfectly good but not selling because they required a certain amount of cooking knowledge. Day-old bread was still good bread, sold at a discount if you knew to ask. She knew to ask. There is something subtle and important here about the social dynamics of the transaction. She was a regular customer, she was known, she had a relationship with the man behind the counter, and she had developed over years of shopping in these same stores a way of asking that never sounded like asking at all. It sounded like noticing. She would pick up the slightly soft peaches and turn them in her hand thoughtfully and say something like, "These are getting a little ripe, aren't they?" almost to herself, and set them down again. And quite often the grocer would say, "I can let you have those for half price. They need to move today." And she would smile and say, "Well, in that case," and put them in her basket. She was simply making observations that created an opening for a better price. The produce still sold, the grocer moved his soft inventory, and she came home with fruit for half what she would have paid if she had simply put it in her basket without a word. The savings on a transaction like that might be only 50 cents, but 50 cents in 1953 bought 2 pounds of coffee, and it all went into the jar. Number 26 is something that historians who study this era tend to call the egg money system, and it has a long history that stretches back well before the 1950s, but found its clearest expression in the domestic economy of post-war suburban America. Many families in the 1950s, even in suburban areas, kept chickens. Not every family, but enough that it was unremarkable. Eggs were a practical food source. The garden was often still productive in the way that pre-war families had always maintained, and a small flock of hens required very little in the way of money to maintain if you had the space. What they did require was care, and care was her job. The hens were her domain. The eggs they produced were, in a tradition that stretched back generations on American farms, considered her money, not the household's money, hers. The egg money was a kind of informal economic acknowledgement that the labor she invested in the chickens produced a product with real value, and the proceeds of selling that product belonged to the laborer. She would sell eggs to neighbors, to the corner store, occasionally to the diner down the street if she had a surplus. A dozen eggs in the early 1950s fetched around 50 to 60 cents at retail. She might move 2 or 3 dozen a week beyond what the family used, which added $1 or $1.50 to her income that was entirely off the household books and entirely hers. The egg money could fund small things without explanation. A birthday gift for a friend that she didn't have to account for in the grocery budget. A length of fabric for a new dress that didn't come out of the household allowance. A contribution to the church social that didn't require her to ask her husband for extra. The egg money was a small but genuine form of financial independence, earned through her own labor on her own side project, operating in the cracks of the official household economy. Some women extended this system to other small-scale production, garden vegetables sold to neighbors, canned preserves traded or sold at the church bazaar, a few dozen cookies sold to the school fundraiser. The pattern was consistent. She produced something, she sold it, the money was hers. The amounts were small individually but persistent, and persistence is exactly what builds a jar over time. Now, number 25, and this one is about something that happened every laundry day, every ironing afternoon, in kitchens all over suburban America, and which husbands witnessed regularly without ever comprehending what they were looking at. She darned things. She darned socks instead of buying new ones. She turned fraying shirt collars before the shirts became unwearable. She let out hems on children's clothing as the children grew, squeezing another 6 months of wear out of a dress before it had to be replaced. She recut worn sheets into pillowcases, and worn pillowcases into cleaning rags, and worn cleaning rags into stuffing for pincushions and padded hangers. Nothing left the house until it had been used completely down to its last practical incarnation. In dollar terms, this was significant. A man's dress shirt in the early 1950s cost somewhere between $4 and $6, which represented an entire day's wages for many workers. A pair of children's shoes ran $2 to $3. A set of sheets was $3 to $4. Every item she repaired, extended, or repurposed was money that stayed in the household rather than cycling back to the department store, and money that stayed in the household could be redirected toward the jar. What makes this economically interesting is that the labor involved, the hours of darning and turning and letting out and cutting down, was genuinely skilled labor, valued at nothing in the official economy because it was performed by a woman in her own home on behalf of her own family. If a professional seamstress had done the same work, it would have cost money. Because she did it, it cost only her time, which was considered already fully owned by the household and therefore free. She understood this arrangement even if she never articulated it in those terms. She understood that her skill was capital, and she deployed that capital with deliberate intention. Number 24 is connected to the darning and the repairing, but it operates at a slightly higher level of sophistication. It is about where she shopped for things that genuinely had to be replaced, and it was a strategy that a certain kind of woman had down to a precise science. She had a sense of the retail calendar that was more accurate than any advertisement. Department stores in the 1950s ran predictable sales cycles, and she had internalized those cycles through years of attention. White sales in January, when linens, towels, and domestic goods went at their lowest prices of the year. End of summer clearances in August, when children's clothing for the current size went on steep discount just as the school year was starting. Coat sales in February, when winter outerwear hit prices she could afford for next year. She did not buy things when she needed them. She bought things when the price was right, which meant she was always shopping a season ahead, always buying on the downswing of the retail price cycle rather than at the peak. The coordination required to do this was not trivial. She had to track what the family would need, estimate sizes for growing children, keep her own informal inventory of household goods, and exercise the restraint required to not buy things at full price simply because they were currently needed. Instead, she would make do with what was wearing thin while she waited for the price to come down. A coat with a slightly fraying lining could last one more winter. A towel with a worn edge was still a towel. She tolerated the imperfect present in order to buy the replacement at a price that made sense. This is a form of financial patience that most people in the modern era, with instant delivery and credit cards, have largely lost the cultural habit of practicing. Number 23 is the one I teased you about at the beginning of this story. This is the one that allowed a woman to buy something expensive without anyone in the house noticing where the money came from. It is called layaway, and it was, in the hands of a skilled household manager, a financial instrument of genuine power. Layaway worked simply. You went to the store, you selected the item you wanted, and you paid a small deposit to have it held. Then you paid it off in installments over weeks or months, and when it was fully paid, you took it home. No credit, no interest, no signature from your husband, just you and the store clerk and a running balance on a card filed somewhere in a drawer behind the counter. She used layaway for Christmas gifts, building them up quietly through the fall, paying small amounts each week out of the grocery change and the egg money and whatever other small surpluses she had accumulated. She used it for the children's winter coats, paying into them through summer and early fall so they were ready in October. She used it for things she wanted that she knew a direct request for money would complicate or create friction about. A specific kitchen appliance, a piece of furniture she had wanted for the living room, a set of curtains for the bedroom. She simply began paying toward it, week by week, using money that was already hers and that she had already accounted for in ways that didn't require explanation. Her husband would come home one day, and there would be a new lamp, a very nice lamp. He might raise an eyebrow, and she would say, "I have been putting a little aside," which was entirely true, and the conversation would typically end there because the lamp was already in the room, and it looked good, and the money was clearly already spent, and there was nothing to negotiate about. The decision had been made, the purchase was done. What was there to discuss? This is what some historians call the quiet veto and its financial inverse, the quiet approval, operating in perfect coordination. She made the decision. She funded it through her own small economy. She executed it through a mechanism that bypassed any requirement for his involvement, and when it appeared as a fact rather than a proposal. Facts are much harder to argue with than proposals. Number 22 takes us into a different corner of the domestic economy, one that had nothing to do with the grocery store or the department store, but everything to do with the neighborhood. She traded, not formally, not with contracts or record-keeping, but in the dense informal barter economy that existed in every residential neighborhood in 1950s America, where women exchanged goods and services with each other in a network of reciprocal obligation that was entirely invisible to the official economy and entirely real in its consequences. She baked bread and her neighbor had a garden. She watched the neighbor's children on Tuesday afternoons, and the neighbor brought vegetables on Thursday. Another woman on the street had a sewing machine that could handle heavy fabric for upholstery work, and she had a pressure canner that could process a season's worth of tomatoes in an afternoon. These resources circulated through the neighborhood in a web of traded favors that reduced what any individual household had to buy with cash money. The economics are genuinely interesting when you trace them carefully. If she bought bread at the store, that was a recurring cash expense. If she baked bread and traded a loaf to her neighbor in exchange for a basket full of green beans, both women had reduced their cash outflow without reducing their standard of living. The bread still existed, the beans still existed, but no money had changed hands. Multiply that by dozens of small exchanges over the course of a year with multiple neighbors, and the cash savings were real and significant. There is also something in the structure of this informal economy worth appreciating. It required and maintained trust. You gave before you received, or at least you gave with the expectation that you would receive in due course, which meant the whole system ran on relationships, on reputation, on the social fabric of knowing your neighbors well enough to rely on them. She invested in those relationships consciously, and the return on that investment was partly social and partly economic and entirely off any official ledger. Number 21, and we are now getting into the strategies that required a more deliberate kind of planning, the ones where you can really see the intelligence working in the system. She had a household inventory. Most people do not think of maintaining a household inventory as a financial strategy, but in the domestic economy of the 1950s, it was one of the most powerful tools she had. She knew, at any given moment, approximately what she had and approximately how long it would last. She knew there were 4 cans of tomatoes in the back of the pantry and that she used about 1 a week, which meant she did not need to buy tomatoes for a month. She knew the sugar was running low and would need to be replaced before the end of the week. She knew that the dish soap under the sink was still half full, but the laundry powder was almost gone. This sounds mundane, and in a way it is, but its financial consequence is significant. Households without a clear inventory routinely buy things they already have because they cannot remember what they have, and they run out of things they need because they did not notice in time to plan. Both errors cost money. Buying a duplicate of something you already own is waste. Running out of something and needing to make an emergency purchase, often at a less favorable price because you cannot shop around when you are out of something today, is also waste. She avoided both errors through the simple discipline of knowing what she had. And there is a deeper layer to this. When she knew her inventory accurately, she could take advantage of sales in a way that a less organized shopper could not. If coffee went on sale at a price significantly below its normal level, she knew whether she had room to buy 3 cans or 6 cans or none, because she already had 8. She was never buying blind. She was always buying informed. And informed purchasing, at scale and over time, is a genuinely powerful financial strategy. Number 20. And I want to take a moment here to slow down and really sit in the scene, because this strategy is less about a specific technique and more about a habit of mind that ran through everything else. She thought in units, not dollars. Here is what I mean by that. When she bought a £25 bag of flour instead of £5, she was not thinking about the price per bag, she was thinking about the price per cup, because a cup was what she used every time she baked. The £25 bag cost her roughly 75 cents instead of $1.50 for the equivalent amount in smaller bags, which meant she was paying about half as much per cup of flour. The unit economics told the real story, not the sticker price. She applied this logic across her entire purchasing practice, though she would never have called it that. She bought lard in the largest container that made practical sense to use before it went bad. She bought soap powder in the economy size because she used it every week and it would not go stale. She bought canned goods by the case when a good price presented itself because canned goods have a shelf life measured in years, and the price difference between buying 6 at once and buying 1 at a time every week was meaningful across a year. The constraint was always the upfront cash requirement. Buying in bulk meant spending more at once, and in a household running on a tight weekly allowance that was sometimes genuinely difficult. This is where her other strategies fed this one. The egg money helped, the grocery savings jar helped. Having a small reserve of her own money that she could deploy for a strategic bulk purchase was the difference between being able to take advantage of an opportunity and watching it pass. Number 19, and this is the one that might surprise you most of all the ones we have covered so far, because it operated in a space that most people do not think of as part of household economics at all. She managed information. In the 1950s household, she was the person who knew things. She knew what the doctor had said about the youngest child's ear infection and whether the prescription had been fully used. She knew that the car needed new tires before winter and approximately what that would cost. She knew that the mortgage payment was due on the 15th and that last month they had been a day late. She knew which bills were current and which were not. She knew what the insurance policy covered and what it did not. She knew the name of the plumber who had fixed the pipes last winter and what he had charged and whether he was trustworthy or whether he had padded the bill. This information was power, even though she could not hold an account or sign a contract. Because information is what allows you to anticipate problems before they become expensive emergencies, and expensive emergencies, dealt with under pressure without adequate information, have been the financial undoing of households throughout history. She kept records, not formal accounting records, but careful notes in whatever system suited her, sometimes a small notebook, sometimes a box of receipts organized into envelopes, sometimes simply a very good memory, supplemented by a few key dates written in the margins of the calendar that hung beside the telephone. She knew when things needed to be renewed, repaired, or revisited. And because she knew, she could plan. And planning is the foundation of every strategy on this list. Number 18 is about something that happened in the kitchen every single day and that few people outside the domestic sphere of the era ever thought much about. She reduced waste to nearly nothing. The chicken that roasted on Sunday became the sandwiches on Monday, and the soup on Tuesday, and the stock that flavored the soup that Wednesday. The vegetable cooking water that would seem like obvious trash to a modern home cook was saved and used as a base for the next soup, or a liquid for braising. The bread that went stale was revived with a damp cloth and a few minutes in the oven, or cubed into stuffing, or soaked in milk and eggs for a bread pudding that fed 4 people on something that was essentially nothing. Bacon fat was saved in a small tin near the stove and used for frying in place of lard. Coffee grounds were used once, rinsed, and used a second time for a weaker but still perfectly serviceable second cup. Fat from roasting was saved and used for baking or for waterproofing boots. Nothing, genuinely nothing, left the kitchen before it had been fully used. The direct financial savings from this practice were real and measurable, though she never sat down to calculate them in any formal way. A family that wasted 15 to 20% of the food they bought, which is approximately what most American households do today, was spending 15 to 20% more on food than a family that wasted almost nothing. On a grocery budget of $40 a week, that gap represented $6 to $8, which is a meaningful sum when you are trying to fill a jar behind the coffee canister. But there is something else in this practice beyond the pure economics. It expressed a relationship to resources, to material things, to the things you had and the work that went into acquiring them, that shaped everything else she did. Nothing was free, everything cost someone something, either money or labor or time, and none of those things were unlimited. Using things fully was not just frugality, it was a kind of respect for the reality of what things actually cost. Number 17, and we are now going to move into a slightly different kind of strategy, one that was less about managing what came in and more about managing how decisions got made. She controlled the menu, and the menu controlled the budget. This is more subtle than it sounds. In the 1950s household, it was widely accepted that she decided what the family ate. He went to work, she went to the grocery store, she decided on the menu. He sat down at the table and ate what appeared before him without much discussion about what it had cost or what alternatives might have been available. This gave her enormous discretionary control over the single largest variable in the household budget. If she wanted to reduce the grocery bill for a few weeks to fund something specific she was planning for, she could shift toward less expensive ingredients without announcing that she was doing so. Bean soup instead of beef stew, egg dishes on the nights when meat would normally appear, more bread and less protein at the Sunday dinner, more potato and less roast. These substitutions reduced cost while maintaining volume, which is the critical element, because a family that felt hungry at the table would notice and complain, and a family that felt full on simpler food would not, or at least would not connect their sense of fullness to the fact that the dish had cost 30 cents instead of $1.10. She was in effect managing the family's caloric intake while managing the budget simultaneously, and she had both the daily opportunity and the exclusive information needed to do it without anyone tracking what she was doing. Menu planning was invisible work, performed by the person who did it and unexamined by everyone who benefited from it. Number 16 takes us into the world of credit and debt, which is a world that operated very differently for 1950s housewives than we might assume. She managed informal credit relationships with local merchants, running a tab at the grocery store, the kind of arrangement where she bought on credit and settled up at the end of the week or the end of the month, was still common in the early 1950s, particularly in the smaller neighborhood stores that coexisted with the new supermarkets. These arrangements were entirely informal, based on personal relationship and trust, and they gave her a small degree of temporal flexibility in the household cash flow that could be genuinely important in tight weeks. But beyond the simple running tab, some women managed something more sophisticated. They developed a reputation as reliable, timely, trustworthy customers with specific merchants, and they used that reputation as a kind of social credit that translated into real financial advantage. The butcher who knew she always settled on time might quietly set aside a particularly good cut for her, or alert her when something was going to be on special, or give her a better price on a large order. The dry goods store where she had shopped for years might extend a little extra flexibility during a particularly tight month. Relationship was capital, quietly accumulated over years of reliable dealing. This was especially important for major purchases. When the washing machine needed to be replaced, or the icebox gave out and had to be upgraded to a proper refrigerator, The informal credit relationships she had maintained could mean the difference between a manageable installment arrangement and a payment that broke the budget. She had invested years in being the kind of customer that merchants wanted to accommodate, and those investments paid tangible dividends in the moments when they mattered most. Number 15 is one that I think every woman of that era understood intuitively, but almost none of them would have described as a strategy. It was simply how you operated. But looking at it now, it has a shape and a logic that is genuinely impressive. She separated wants from needs with almost surgical precision, not in the abstract, philosophical sense in which we sometimes talk about that distinction today, in the concrete, daily, $27 a week sense of knowing exactly which of the items on the grocery list were non-negotiable and which were preferences that could be deferred or replaced with something cheaper. The coffee was a non-negotiable in most households. A specific brand of coffee was a preference that could be adjusted when the store brand went on sale. Shoes for growing children were a non-negotiable. Shoes that were specifically the style the child preferred were a preference that could be negotiated down to shoes that fit and would last. She applied this passing constantly and with very little ceremony. It was not a dramatic philosophical exercise, it was just how she thought about the items on the list. And because she maintained it consistently over years and decades, the cumulative effect on the household's financial health was enormous. Every substituted preference, every deferred upgrade, every need met at the lowest reasonable cost rather than the most satisfying cost, added to the margin that made everything else possible. The interesting thing is that this mental discipline, maintained for so long that it became essentially automatic, also shaped how she understood her own desires. She genuinely did not always know the difference between what she wanted and what she thought she should want in the abstract. But she knew what things cost, and she knew what the budget was, and that knowledge set the practical boundaries within which desire operated. It was a constrained economy in every sense. Number 14 is about insurance, and this might seem like an odd entry in a list about household money tricks, but the way 1950s housewives thought about risk management was genuinely sophisticated in ways that the era never recognized or celebrated. She maintained a pantry reserve. This is different from simply stocking the pantry, which we have already discussed in the context of bulk buying and inventory management. The pantry reserve was specifically a buffer against disruption. It was the answer to the question of what happens if something goes wrong this week, financially or practically, and we cannot do the normal grocery run or the normal routine. She kept, always, a quantity of staples sufficient to feed the family for at least 1 to 2 weeks without any additional purchases. Dried beans, rice or cornmeal, canned goods in variety, flour, salt, sugar, lard or shortening, coffee, dried fruit or canned fruit. These were not the fancy items. These were the foundation items, the things from which a meal could be constructed even when everything else was unavailable. The financial logic here is about resilience. An unexpected expense, a week when the budget was blown by a car repair or a medical bill or a plumbing emergency, could devastate a household that was running with no food reserve, because then you still had to feed the family on a budget that had just been zeroed out by something else. If you had the pantry reserve, you could redirect the grocery money entirely toward the emergency for a week or two and still keep people fed. The reserve was not food savings, it was financial insurance in edible form. Maintaining that reserve was an ongoing discipline. Every time she drew from it, she made a mental note, and the next week when funds allowed, she replaced what she had used. The reserve was never allowed to erode below its floor. This required the kind of consistent, unspectacular attention that most heroic financial stories never bother to include, but which is in the end what distinguishes households that weather difficulties from households that do not. Number 13, and I want to slow down again here because this one is not about a specific technique but about something more fundamental, a quality of attention that made all the other strategies possible. She paid attention to where money went, even when she was not supposed to be paying attention to money at all. In the official domestic ideology of the 1950s, the husband managed the money and the wife managed the household. He dealt with the bank, the investments if any, the insurance policies, the mortgage. She dealt with the grocery budget and the children's clothing. The lines were considered separate and were sometimes even kept separate intentionally, either because he did not think she needed to know the larger financial picture, or because knowing it would have created the impression that she was overstepping her sphere. And yet, she paid attention. She noticed when he was tense about money. She noticed when the household allowance was adjusted, upward or downward. She noticed which bills arrived in the mail, and when the expression on his face changed as he opened them. She asked questions that seemed casual but were not. Questions about where they stood with the mortgage, about whether the car insurance was paid, about whether they had enough saved for the inevitable furnace repair. She gathered information from these conversations and from her own observations, and she used it to calibrate her own household management accordingly, tightening where she needed to, relaxing where she could afford to, always keeping her own small reserves in better shape than the official picture would have suggested she needed to. This was financial awareness operating under conditions that officially discouraged it, and it was, for many women, the skill that kept the household solvent through the various unexpected pressures that fell on middle-class families in the 1950s, the car repairs and the medical bills, and the occasional lost job, and the slow inflation that quietly eroded the purchasing power of a fixed household allowance. She saw it coming, often before he did, because she was paying attention to the small things from which the large picture is composed. Number 12. We have been in the kitchen for a while, and now I want to take you to the bedroom, specifically to the sewing basket. The sewing basket was a financial tool, not metaphorically, literally. Women who are genuinely skilled with a needle could make clothing for the family at a fraction of the cost of buying it ready-made. And in the 1950s, a significant proportion of housewives had exactly those skills, having learnt them from their mothers and grandmothers, in an era when home sewing was not a hobby, but a basic domestic competency. A cotton dress pattern in the early 1950s cost 25 to 50 cents. The fabric and notions to make it might run $2 to $3 total. The equivalent dress bought at the department store would cost $5 to $8. She made the dress. She made it with competence, often with a skill that produced a result indistinguishable from the store-bought version to anyone who was not a professional seamstress. And she banked the difference between what she spent and what she would have spent, which went into the household budget and, in amounts she could manage, into the jar. Beyond clothing, she sewed curtains, pillowcases, aprons, children's costumes, covers for worn furniture, quilts from the scraps of fabric too small for anything else. Each of these represented something that did not have to be bought, and the cumulative value of that over the course of a year, across all the things a household needs that can be sewn rather than purchased, was real and significant. There is an additional dimension here worth noticing. The sewing basket also gave her a legitimate, socially approved reason to spend money on fabric and notions without detailed accounting, because buying fabric to make things was clearly part of her domestic work. A woman who simply appeared to be spending on household supplies was doing her job. A woman who bought a new dress for herself without explanation might face questions, but buying fabric to make a dress was obviously appropriate and obviously efficient. She knew the difference between those categories, and she worked within it. Number 11. And I told you this would be something he saw every week without understanding it. Every single week without fail, she shopped alone. This sounds unremarkable until you understand exactly what it meant in practice. He gave her the housekeeping money. She went to the grocery store alone, without him. She knew the prices, he did not. She knew what she needed, he did not. She knew the store layout, the sales patterns, which checker was fast and which was slow, which produce was fresh and which had been sitting since the day before. He knew none of this because he was never there. What this meant economically was that every negotiation she did in the grocery store, every decision she made about what to buy at what price, every substitution she made when the usual item was priced too high, every surplus she generated through careful management of the trip, occurred in a space where she had complete information and complete authority. There was no one looking over her shoulder. There was no one asking why she was buying the large bag of flour instead of the small one. There was no 1 second guessing whether they really needed that extra can of tomatoes, or whether the store brand would do just as well as the national brand. She was the sole decision-maker, operating in her area of expertise, with no interference. Compare this to households where husbands occasionally came along on grocery trips, and you begin to appreciate the difference immediately. When he was there, purchases often went up. He picked up things that were not on the list. He was drawn to the more expensive versions of things because the price difference seemed small, and he was not tracking the weekly cumulative budget. He bought soda and extra meat and sometimes a box of cookies that she had not planned for because they looked good and the money did not feel as real to him when he was in the store as it did to her when she was balancing the week's books in her head. Her exclusive authority in the grocery store was not just a social convenience, it was a financial protection. She kept him out of it, usually quite naturally, because it was her job, and neither of them questioned that. And she managed the grocery run with the care and precision that any competent professional applies to their work. The savings from that competence were real, ongoing, and entirely unacknowledged. Number 10 is about something that happens in the most intimate economic space of the household. At the moment when he hands over the weekly housekeeping money, she managed the ask. This is a delicate strategy that operated at the intersection of psychology and economics, and I want to explain it carefully because it is more sophisticated than it might initially appear. He gave her the housekeeping money based on some calculation he had arrived at, either consciously or through habit, of what the household needed each week. That number was established at some point, probably early in the marriage, and it tended to remain relatively fixed unless she asked for more or unless some obvious change in circumstances made an adjustment unavoidable. Inflation quietly eroded the real value of a fixed allowance year by year, which meant that over time she was effectively managing an increasingly tight budget on the same nominal amount. How she handled the moment when she needed a higher allowance was a matter of considerable practical importance. A direct request stating that the money was insufficient would often trigger defensiveness or a suspicion that she was not managing well, or a negotiation she was unlikely to win simply because she was in the weaker position in any financial discussion. She could not show him her books. She could not point to her price-tracking notebook as evidence of her efficiency. She could not say, "Here is proof that I am extracting maximum value from this money, and it is still not enough," without seeming to be making some kind of accusation. What she could do instead was manage the timing and framing. She waited for moments when he was relaxed and in a good mood. She framed the request around specific, concrete, unavoidable expenses rather than a general sense of inadequacy. The children's shoes need replacing, and the dentist appointment is next week, so I'll be a little short this month, is a different conversation than the grocery money is not enough. She connected her needs to things he already understood were necessary. She made the ask feel like problem-solving rather than complaint, and she kept the amount of the ask at the lower end of what she actually needed because she had her own reserves to supplement when required. This was the quiet, unglamorous, daily economic work of negotiating within an unequal structure without the leverage to demand equality directly. She did not change the structure, she worked it with the intelligence and patience available to her. And over time, across thousands of these small negotiations in millions of households, the cumulative result was that most families ate, stayed clothed, maintained their houses, and produced children who grew up without experiencing the kind of genuine deprivation that the official household finances might, in a bad week, have suggested was approaching. Let us rest here for a moment in the story. We are halfway down the list, and I want to take a breath with you. There is something I think about when I read the histories of these women, the surveys and the oral histories, and the occasional diaries that survived. These were not women who thought of themselves as financial geniuses. They thought of themselves as doing their job. They thought of themselves as wives and mothers managing households, which was what they were supposed to be doing, and the financial strategies we have been examining were simply the competence with which they executed that role. But the competence was real, the system was real. The money was real, and the discipline required to run a household economy at that level of careful management, year after year, without recognition, without official authority, without a bank account in your own name, without any of the legal and institutional tools that we now take for granted as the basic apparatus of financial life. That discipline was something genuinely impressive, not romantic, not softened into something gentler than it was, just honest, practical, quiet competence in the service of keeping a family economically intact. Let us continue. Number 9, and this one moves us into a strategy that operated on a longer time horizon than most of what we have discussed so far. She built a relationship with the insurance man. In the 1950s, life insurance salesmen were a fixture of suburban American life. They came to the house, they sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked to whoever was home, which was usually her. Over the course of many such visits, over the years of policy renewals and occasional claims, and the general business of a household maintaining its insurance, she often developed a clearer understanding of what the policies actually said and what they actually covered than her husband did, simply because she was the one who was home when the insurance man came, and she was the one who listened carefully to what he said. This information advantage was significant in specific moments, when it came time to renew or adjust coverage, when a claim needed to be filed, when the question arose of whether a particular expense was covered. She often knew the answer before the question was even completed, and knowing the answer meant being able to guide the decision. Even officially, the decision was his. A woman who knew that the house insurance covered specific types of water damage would make sure the plumber wrote up the repair in a way that qualified for reimbursement, rather than in a way that did not. A woman who understood the life insurance policy terms would know what documentation to gather in the event of a claim, rather than discovering too late that something critical was missing. A woman who knew the automobile insurance deductible precisely could make the correct calculation about whether to file a claim or pay out of pocket without that decision being blown by imprecision. This knowledge was not dramatic, it did not announce itself, but in the moments when it mattered, it saved money and protected the household in ways that an uninformed household, relying on the person who had signed the policy but never read it carefully, might easily have lost. Number 8. And this takes us all the way to the most fundamental economic activity of the suburban 1950s household, the relationship with the bank itself. Many women, as we have discussed, could not hold their own bank account, but many women found ways to have a functional relationship with money that served as a partial substitute for the banking access they were officially denied. She managed cash. Specifically, she managed cash in a way that gave her something that the bank account gave her husband, a running account of what she had, what she owed, and what she needed. She kept her household cash in an organized way, sometimes in the famous set of envelopes that women of this era talk about when they share their grandmother's financial habits. Each envelope labeled for a specific purpose: groceries, utilities, clothing, household repairs, church offering. Each week's allowance divided at the moment of receipt into its designated envelopes, and each expenditure drawn from the appropriate envelope. When an envelope was empty, that category was empty. You did not borrow from the grocery envelope to cover clothing. You managed with what was there. This envelope system, or some informal equivalent of it, served the purpose that a checking account serves. It gave her visibility into the specific financial position of each category in real time, without the need for ledgers or accounting skills, or any of the formal apparatus of institutional banking. It was banking on the kitchen table, with paper and cash, and her own careful attention substituting for everything else. The women who maintained this practice with consistency tended to avoid the small, expensive surprises that plague disorganized household finances. They did not reach the end of the week and discover they had run out of grocery money because they had forgotten about some earlier purchase. They did not fail to pay the utility bill because the cash was mixed up with money set aside for something else. They knew where the money was because they had put it there deliberately and they were tracking it daily. Number 7 is about something that happened once a year, or perhaps twice, in every well-run household of the era, a practice that has been largely lost in the modern world, but which represents one of the most genuinely effective forms of financial management available to someone working with a limited budget. She took inventory of everything and she priced it. Not like a retail inventory with formal counts and spreadsheets, more like a deliberate walkthrough of the household, conducted with eyes that were tracking value rather than just familiarity. What is here? What is it worth? What is it actually costing us to maintain or operate? What could be sold, traded, or repurposed if we needed to free up resources for something else? In a 1950s suburban household, there was typically a surprising amount of material value sitting around in forms that were not immediately recognized as assets. There was the fabric remnants from sewing projects that could be sold to a quilter or traded for something useful. There were the children's outgrown clothing and toys that could be sold at a neighborhood exchange or traded with the family across the street whose children were the right age for them now. There were the kitchen implements that had been replaced by something better and were sitting in the back of a drawer, unused and unneeded. There were the curtains from the last house that had never been rehemmed to fit the windows in this one, and were therefore sitting in a box rather than hanging anywhere. She knew what was in those boxes and drawers and back of the closet spaces, because she had put it all there and she had kept track. And periodically she went through and identified what could be liquidated, informally, through neighborhood networks and church exchanges and the various informal markets that existed for used household goods in communities where everyone was living on roughly similar budgets and everyone had something they needed and something they could spare. The amounts from any individual transaction were small, but the habit of seeing household possessions as assets rather than simply as things, of understanding that a children's coat that no longer fit a child was not worthless but merely in the wrong household and could be traded for something the right size, was a habit of mind that kept resources in circulation rather than letting them accumulate as clutter. And a household with low clutter and high circulation of its assets is a financially healthier household than one that hoards what it does not use. Number 6. We are getting close to the ones that I think will stay with you longest. The ones that required not just practical skill, but something closer to genuine strategic intelligence. She controlled the calendar. Specifically, she controlled the timing of expenses within the month and within the year in ways that allowed her to manage cash flow despite having no formal access to credit. Here is what I mean. Many of the major discretionary expenses in a 1950s household were negotiable in their timing. Christmas gifts could be bought in November at regular prices or in the after-Christmas sales and stored for 11 months. School supplies could be bought in bulk during back-to-school sales and held in reserve. The children's winter coats could be purchased in February when the season's inventory was being cleared at deep discounts rather than in September when it was full price and she was competing with every other mother in the neighborhood doing the same thing at the same time. Managing these timing decisions over the course of a year required holding two things in mind simultaneously: the household's current cash position, which fluctuated week to week depending on expenses and allowance, and the upcoming calendar of purchases, which was fairly predictable if you thought about it clearly. She coordinated these two streams of information to make purchases when she had cash available and when the price was favorable, rather than making purchases when she needed the item at whatever the current price happened to be. This temporal arbitrage, to use the economic language she never would have used, produced real savings that were hard to measure precisely because they were distributed across dozens of small decisions over the course of the year. But families who managed the calendar in this way consistently spent less on the same goods and services than families who simply bought things when they needed them, because the former were often on the right side of the retail price cycle and the latter were almost always on the wrong side. Number 5, and now we are into the truly remarkable territory, the strategies that required not just intelligence but something like vision, the ability to see the future of the household's financial needs and position for them before they arrived. She prepared for the emergencies that had not happened yet. This is closely related to the pantry reserve strategy we discussed earlier, but it extends far beyond food into the whole domain of household expenses. A washing machine that was 10 years old was going to need to be replaced. She did not know when, but she knew it was coming, so she started, quietly, putting a little aside specifically for that purpose, in addition to the general jar, in a separate envelope or container that she mentally labeled washing machine, even if no label was physically written on it. A child who would start school in 2 years would need a whole new wardrobe of appropriate clothing. 2 years was plenty of time to prepare for that, to watch for sales and buy ahead, to make pieces when she had time and fabric was cheap, to accumulate what was needed gradually, rather than facing the September panic purchase when every other mother was buying and the prices reflected that collective urgency. The roof was probably fine, but it was aging. The gutters needed attention every few years. The furnace had been making a noise that suggested its time was not unlimited. None of these things were crises yet, but each of them was a foreseeable future expense, and a household that had been quietly preparing for them would navigate them very differently from a household that would be caught by surprise and scrambling. She could not set up a formal sinking fund at the bank. She could not open a dedicated savings account for each anticipated expense. What she could do was manage her own cash in a way that tracked those needs, accumulating for each one as opportunities arose, and deploying those accumulations when the time came. It was the same principle as the formal sinking fund. It just lived in her kitchen and ran on her personal discipline rather than an institutional framework. Number 4, and this is the one that required the most subtle reading of her social environment, the one that made use of relationships in a way that transcended pure economic exchange. She cultivated the right friendships with strategic awareness. I want to be careful here because this sounds more cynical than it actually was in practice. The friendships she built were real friendships based on genuine affection and shared values and the deep bonds of women who were raising children in similar circumstances in close proximity to each other. But she was not naive about the fact that some friendships were also financially consequential in ways that others were not. The woman who was friendly with the pharmacist's wife had, through that friendship, a relationship that occasionally made a difference when a prescription needed to be called in after hours or when a question arose about a medication that required professional knowledge to answer. The woman who was close to the woman whose husband managed the local hardware store knew that occasionally there would be a call to say something is going in the trash that you might be able to use. Would you like it before it goes? The woman who had invested years in being genuinely helpful to the wife of the local grocer found consistently that her relationship with the store reflected that investment in small but real ways. These were not calculated transactions, they were relationships. But she understood, as women have always understood, that relationships have economic dimensions that are not separate from their human dimensions but interwoven with them. Being useful, being reliable, being the kind of neighbor and friend who could be counted on was both the right way to live and the financially smart way to live, because usefulness and reliability generate reciprocity, and reciprocity is a form of wealth that does not appear on any balance sheet but is absolutely real in its effects. Number 3, and I want to sit with this one for a moment before I explain it, because it is the strategy that I think most clearly expresses the quality of intelligence that ran through everything else these women did. She understood that her own labor had a market value, even though the market refused to pay her for it. This is not a metaphorical observation, it is a practical financial one. The labor that she performed in the household, the cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, the childcare, the record-keeping, the shopping, the medical management of the family's health, the social relationship management that kept the household connected to the community. All of this labor had a market value that could be calculated by asking what it would cost to replace it with paid labor. The domestic worker who could perform all of these functions would have needed a cook's wages, a seamstress's wages, a nurse's wages, a bookkeeper's wages, a social director's wages, all added together. She understood this, even without the formal economic language for it, because she had lived in households where some of this work was paid, because she had hired out some of it in difficult moments and seen what it cost, because she had friends who had lost their own ability to perform some of this work through illness and watched the financial strain of replacing it. What this understanding gave her was a framework for making certain decisions. When she calculated whether it made financial sense to take in washing, or give music lessons, or do alterations for neighbors, or do any of the small income-generating activities that were socially acceptable for a married woman of her class in the 1950s, she was asking whether the external income from the activity exceeded its opportunity cost, which is to say, whether the money she could earn exceeded the cost of the household work that would not get done while she was doing the paid work instead. This is sophisticated economic thinking, entirely without training in economics, arrived at through the practical necessity of managing limited time alongside limited money. Number 2. We have been circling around this one throughout the entire story, but now I want to address it directly because it is the strategy that synthesized everything else, the one that all the other strategies were in service of. She built a cushion, not a large one, not a dramatic one, just a small, persistent, consistently maintained financial cushion that existed between what the household actually needed to survive and what she had available to manage those needs. The jar behind the coffee canister, the envelope labeled washing machine, the small amount she kept back from the household allowance each week, reliably, even when it was only 50 cents, the egg money, the grocery savings, the avoided waste and the bought ahead and the traded favors and the managed timing. All of it accumulated, slowly and imperfectly and without fanfare, into a financial cushion. The cushion did several things. It meant that a small emergency did not become a large crisis. It meant that a good buying opportunity did not have to be passed by simply because the timing was inconvenient. It meant that she could afford to be patient, to wait for the sale, to decline the purchase that was convenient but not essential. A household running right at the edge of its financial capacity, with no cushion at all, is forced into every bad decision simultaneously, because when you have no margin, you have no choices. Every expense has to be paid at whatever price it arrives at. Every emergency has to be handled with whatever money is available, which is usually none. Every purchase has to be made when it must be made, rather than when it makes sense. The cushion changed all of that. And building a cushion was the central financial project of the well-run 1950s household, pursued through every strategy we have discussed, and all the ones that were never written down because they were too ordinary, too specific, too embedded in the daily texture of ordinary domestic life to seem worth recording. And now number one, the most fundamental, the most powerful, the one that made all the others possible, and that would be almost invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. She kept going. She showed up every week with the grocery list. She put something in the jar even when it was only 25 cents. She maintained the pantry reserve when it would have been easier to skip the rebuilding after she had drawn it down. She kept the price book even when the prices had not changed in months. She made the bean soup on the night when something more expensive was technically possible but not actually necessary. She turned the collar on the shirt that was starting to fray at the edges, instead of deciding it was already too worn to bother. She paid the 15 cents into layaway for the Christmas gift when 15 cents felt like nothing. She kept going with the small disciplines of household economics, week after week, month after month, year after year, not because any individual act was significant in itself, but because the accumulation was. $1 a week into the jar is $52 a year. $52 a year for 20 years is $1,040, which in 1970 was meaningful money, money enough to fund a child's first semester of college, or cover a major home repair, or provide a financial buffer against a sudden illness or job loss that could otherwise have unraveled the household stability entirely. The power in this is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not require genius or exceptional talent or unusual access to information or resources. It requires only consistency, the kind that comes from understanding why you are doing the thing, from having internalized the logic of the system clearly enough that the daily maintenance of it feels not like sacrifice, but like the obvious right thing to do. She understood why she was saving. She understood what the jar was for. And that understanding was what made her capable of maintaining the discipline through the weeks when it was hard, through the years when nothing dramatic was happening and the jar was filling up one careful dollar at a time, building toward a future she was preparing for, even though she could not see it yet. Now I want to stay here for a little while, because I think there is something in this story that deserves more than a list, more than 30 strategies numbered and explained. I want to tell you what this all adds up to, across the decades and across the millions of households where it was practiced. By the late 1960s, the women who had been young housewives in the early 1950s were approaching middle age, the children were growing up, the household demands were changing, and in many of those households, there were small but real accumulations of financial resource that had been built, quietly, over 15 or 20 years of careful management by a woman who officially had no financial identity of her own, and whose contributions to the household's economic health would never appear in any official accounting. The jar behind the coffee canister, faithfully maintained across 20 years of weekly deposits, might hold $200 or $300, small by absolute measure, but not small in what it represented. It represented 20 years of discipline, 20 years of finding the margin in a system that was designed to leave her no margin, 20 years of treating her own labor and intelligence and attention as capital, even when the culture around her insisted that they were simply duties, and beyond the jar, there were the larger accumulations. The household that had successfully navigated 20 years without major financial crises, not because nothing bad had ever happened, but because the cushion had absorbed the shocks. The family that had managed to send children to college or make the down payment on a better house, or weather a husband's illness or job change without catastrophic disruption. The financial stability of that family was not an accident. It was the compound interest on 20 years of small, consistent, unglamorous decisions made by a woman who was never given credit for them. Let me tell you about a woman named Geraldine. I am not using her real name because she is a composite of many women, but everything about her is drawn from real histories and oral accounts from this era. Geraldine married in 1951. She was 23 years old. Her husband Robert worked at the local manufacturing plant, earning about $60 a week, which was a decent but not exceptional income for a young family in a medium-sized Midwestern city. She stayed home because that was what women of her class and era did, and she managed the household on the $40 a week that Robert handed her on Friday evenings. In the first year, she discovered the price book, not through any instruction, but through the simple frustration of repeatedly finding herself short at the end of the week, unable to explain exactly where the money had gone. She began writing down prices. She began noticing the patterns. Within 3 months, she had reduced the average grocery cost by about $1.50 a week, without any noticeable reduction in what the family ate. $1.50 a week is not dramatic, but she put $1 of it in the jar and used the other 50 cents to rebuild her pantry reserve, which she had also recently discovered the value of. By the second year, the jar held $47. She used 30 of it to pay cash for the children's school clothes in the August clearance sales, which saved her about $8 over what she would have spent buying them in September. The remaining $17 went back into the jar. By the third year, the jar held $62, and she began a separate envelope for the washing machine, which she estimated had about 5 more years in it. 5 years. She had time. By 1965, 14 years into her marriage, her private financial system had evolved into something considerably more sophisticated than the original jar. She had 6 envelopes, each with a specific purpose and a running balance that she tracked in a small notebook. She had the washing machine fund, which had successfully replaced the machine 3 years earlier without any emergency or debt. She had a clothes fund, a household repair fund, a Christmas fund that she started in January every year and finished in October without ever buying on credit, a small education fund that she had been building since her eldest was 2 years old, and the general emergency jar that had grown from its original pickle jar into a proper tin box that had been a Christmas cookie tin, repurposed for a more permanent duty. Robert knew she was careful. He knew she was good with money. He did not know the details because the details were hers to manage, and he had always been comfortable with that division. When the washing machine was replaced in 1962, he was surprised to find that she already had the money for it, already set aside, already enough for a good machine and not a cheap one. He did not ask how, specifically. He said something about her being a good manager, which was true, and which was all the acknowledgement that was going to come from that direction, and she smiled and put the new machine through its first cycle and went back to the kitchen. I think about women like Geraldine often when I read about the women's liberation movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s and the legal changes that followed, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, the gradual expansion of women's right to hold accounts in their own names, to establish credit independently, to have a financial identity that did not require a husband's signature to be legally real. These were changes that mattered enormously, that opened up a whole domain of economic life to women that had been officially closed to them. But for women like Geraldine, they arrived late in the story. She had already built something. She had already figured out how to have an economic life inside a system that denied her one officially, and she had maintained that economic life across 20-plus years of marriage with a steadiness and a competence that the system around her never thought to measure. When the legal changes came, women like Geraldine opened their first bank accounts in their own names. For many of them, the first deposit was money from a jar behind the coffee canister, or from a cookie tin that had been repurposed, or from a collection of envelopes that had been maintained through decades of small, consistent, private discipline. The legal system caught up to a reality they had been living in the kitchen for years. Now I want to tell you about something else that these strategies represented, beyond the specific dollars and the specific techniques, because I think there is a way of looking at what these women were doing that goes deeper than practical frugality or even quiet resistance to an unjust system. They were practicing a form of agency inside a structure that officially denied them agency, and what makes that remarkable is not the specific form it took, the jars and the envelopes and the price books and the egg money, but the fact that they chose to exercise it at all. They could have accepted the official terms of the arrangement, which said that financial management was his domain, and her contribution was labor and love, and nothing so concrete as money. Many women did, more or less, accept those terms. The ones we are discussing here chose differently, without ever framing it as a choice, simply by doing the thing that their intelligence and their practical necessity required them to do. There is something in that I find genuinely moving, not in a sentimental way, but in the way that any example of human competence exercised against real limitation tends to be moving when you look at it clearly. These were not extraordinary women in the sense of being exceptional. They were ordinary women, doing what ordinary women did, but doing it with their full intelligence engaged, refusing the passivity that the culture encouraged, maintaining their own economic coherence in the margins of a system that did not officially acknowledge they had any. Let us come down into the final part of this story now, into the long view of what all these small habits and strategies added up to across the decades, because I think this is the most important part, and also the least talked about. The financial historian Barbara Ehrenreich, writing decades later about the economic history of American women, noted that the informal household economics practiced by women in the mid-20th century represented a substantial and entirely unmeasured contribution to family economic stability. She was pointing at exactly what we have been exploring tonight, the accumulated effect of the price books and the jars and the egg money and the careful timing and the managed information and the consistent, patient, long-horizon planning. In macroeconomic terms, the stability of the American middle-class family in the 1950s and 1960s, which is often attributed to strong union wages and growing productivity and the general prosperity of the post-war economy, was built on a foundation that included the invisible financial management of women who had no official economic standing. The official story was that the economy was strong and families were prosperous. The less official story, the one that requires reading the household histories rather than the macroeconomic data, is that families were prosperous in part because women were very good at managing the households on the resources the economy provided, stretching those resources further than any external analysis would have predicted was possible, and maintaining the financial coherence of the domestic unit through all the ordinary pressures and occasional crises that any real family faces across the years. This is not a romantic story. The constraints were real and unjust. The lack of legal financial identity, the inability to hold credit, the exclusion from economic decision-making at every level above the kitchen. These were not small inconveniences. They were structural injustices that shaped women's lives in consequential ways for generations. The cleverness of the household strategies does not excuse or erase the injustice of the system that made those strategies necessary. But the cleverness was real, and I think it deserves to be acknowledged on its own terms, not in spite of the context but fully within it, because understanding what these women actually did with what they had is part of understanding what women are capable of, have always been capable of, when given room to think and act even in constrained spaces. Think about the compound arithmetic of a single year's worth of the strategies we have discussed tonight. The grocery savings generated by the price book and the grocery skimming, perhaps $1.50 per week, which across a year is $78. The avoided waste from full food use and careful pantry management, perhaps another $30 or $40 annually. The clothing savings from sewing, darning, and strategic shopping in clearance seasons, perhaps another $40 to $60. The savings from buying on the right side of the retail price cycle, perhaps $20 to $30. The egg money and other informal income, variable, but perhaps $30 to $50 in a good year. The savings from informal barter and neighborhood exchange, perhaps another $20 to $30 in avoided cash purchases. Add it up and you arrive at something in the range of $200 to $300 per year in effective savings in a household whose total annual income might be $3,000 to $4,000. That is 7 to 10% of household income, generated not through additional earning, but through more efficient management of existing resources. In a household that was officially spending every dollar it received, she was generating a quiet savings rate that would make any financial advisor nod with approval if it appeared in a formal budget. Over 20 years, across the full arc of the strategies operating in coordinations, the cumulative effect was the difference between a family that owned its home free and clear, had helped its children through school, had maintained a financial cushion against unexpected expenses, and had arrived at middle age with something rather than nothing, and a family that had also worked hard and earned the same income but had managed it without the same discipline and arrived at the same point with less, perhaps significantly less, because the small leaks had been allowed to run steadily for 20 years rather than being plugged one at a time. The difference was a woman with a price book and a jar behind the coffee canister and the patience to fill it $1 at a time for 20 years. The difference was attention, sustained over time, applied to the most mundane and least celebrated of all the domains of practical human life, the management of a household's limited resources against its unlimited and ever-expanding needs. I want to tell you about the coffee can. Not the coffee canister on the counter, the decorative one that held the savings. An actual coffee can, the large 2-pound tin with the red lid that Maxwell House sold in the early 1950s for around 80 cents. A good number of women of this era used the actual coffee can, washed and dried and tucked at the back of a kitchen cabinet or the back of a closet shelf, as their primary savings vessel. Not a jar, not an envelope, but the can, with its close-fitting lid and its opaque sides and its perfect anonymity, just another coffee can left over after the grams ran out, the kind of thing you kept because you might need it for something someday. The coffee can as savings vehicle has a long American history that predates the 1950s. Women in rural households of the early 20th century used coffee cans for egg money and garden earnings because coffee cans were practical and ubiquitous and did not draw attention. By the 1950s, when the aluminum can had replaced the older styles and Maxwell House and Folgers were household names in American kitchens, the coffee can had achieved a kind of perfect domestic camouflage. Nobody looked twice at a coffee can in a kitchen cabinet. It could have been holding saved rubber bands, or nails from a small household repair project, or miscellaneous buttons, or literally anything that women of that era used coffee cans to store, which was a surprising and creative range of things. The savings inside were entirely private. There is a kind of poetry in the coffee can as a savings vehicle that I find hard to get away from. It was made for a consumable, for something that was bought, used up, and replaced. She used it for something that accumulated, grew, persisted. She took the container of the household's daily habit, the morning routine, the first cup before anyone else was awake, and she turned it into the container of her own future. That seems right, somehow. That seems like it says something true about how she lived inside the system she inhabited. Let me tell you about the Christmas Club account, because this is a form of household financial management that existed in the formal banking system and that many women used in exactly the way the informal strategies worked. To impose discipline on savings, to create a pre-committed savings mechanism that made it harder to spend money before its intended time. Christmas clubs were savings accounts offered by banks and credit unions in which a depositor would commit to making a small weekly deposit throughout the year, typically starting in January, with the account paying out in full in late November, just before the Christmas shopping season. The deposits were usually small, between 50 cents and $2 a week, and many women participated in Christmas clubs as their primary formal savings mechanism, because the Christmas Club account was one of the few savings vehicles that she could often hold in her own name without controversy, since it was framed as a practical household management tool rather than independent financial accumulation. What made the Christmas Club useful beyond its nominal purpose was that it established the habit of regular, automatic saving in a form that was compatible with the official structure of the household's finances. She could say honestly that she put aside $1 a week for the Christmas Club, and this was understood as prudent household management. The fact that she was simultaneously running several other informal savings streams alongside it was her own business. The Christmas Club also served an educational function for children who were sometimes brought along on the weekly deposit trips to the bank, a gentle introduction to the idea that money could be set aside now for use later, that present sacrifice creates future possibility. The children who grew up watching their mothers make those weekly Christmas club deposits, and who then watch the payout arrive in November and transform into Christmas morning, were absorbing a lesson about the nature and purpose of savings that they would carry, in some form, for the rest of their lives. Let me take you now into the territory of the secondary income streams, the ones beyond the egg money that clever and energetic women of the 1950s developed to supplement the household allowance. These were pursued within the bounds of what was socially acceptable for a married woman of that era, which created real constraints, but within those constraints there was more room than the official picture of the stay-at-home housewife suggests. Music lessons are worth discussing. A woman who had learned piano as a girl, as many middle-class women of the era had, could teach neighborhood children and earn a small but consistent income that was entirely her own. 50 cents to $1 per lesson, a handful of students per week, perhaps $10 to $15 a month that did not come from the household allowance and did not go through any official channel. The money was paid in cash by the parents of her students. It was received by her, and it went wherever she chose to put it. Alterations and dressmaking worked similarly. If she had the sewing skills and the social connections to the women who needed dresses altered or made, she could develop a small informal practice that generated real income. The work was done in her own home during hours that were nominally already allocated to household tasks, so it did not interfere with the visible domestic functions she was expected to perform. It simply occupied the hours that were hers to organize as she saw fit. Bookkeeping was another possibility for women with appropriate skills, working from home for small local businesses that needed simple accounting done but did not need a full-time employee. This was relatively uncommon but not unknown, and it represents an interesting example of a household skill that was otherwise invisible, the bookkeeping that she did for her own household, finding a market value when she applied it to a business that needed the same service. Taking in boarders was a more substantial secondary income stream that some households maintained, renting a spare bedroom to a working person who needed a room and board. This was socially acceptable and reasonably common in working class and lower middle class neighborhoods, where the additional income made a meaningful difference in the household budget. The work involved providing a clean room, breakfast, occasionally other meals, doing the boarder's laundry was her work, performed in her domain, and the income it generated was typically considered part of the household finances rather than specifically hers, but in practice it often came under her management and her discretion in ways that gave her real, if informal, control over it. What all of these secondary income streams had in common is that they operated in the space between the official domestic role, which was unpaid and socially sanctioned, and the formal labor market, which was largely closed to married women in this era, except under specific and often stigmatized conditions. She found the space between them and she worked it with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything else. Let us talk for a moment about something that I think is underappreciated in discussions of 1950s household economics, which is the financial significance of her knowledge about health and medicine. She managed the family's medical costs with a sophistication that was largely invisible because it operated through prevention rather than treatment, and prevention does not generate bills or receipts or any of the other documentation that makes costs visible. She knew which childhood illnesses required a doctor and which did not. She knew the difference between a fever that needed medical attention and a fever that needed watchful waiting and fluids and a cool cloth. She knew the early signs of complications in common childhood illnesses and what to watch for. She knew which home remedies from her own mother's practice actually worked and which were superstition. She kept the family's basic supplies stocked, the things that could address minor injuries and common ailments, without a trip to the doctor, which cost money that a family running on a fixed allowance genuinely felt. Doctors' visits in the 1950s were not covered by insurance for most middle-class families. You paid the doctor directly, and the cost of a routine visit was between $2 and $5, which was a meaningful expense on a $40 a week budget. A trip to the hospital was a financial event of considerable seriousness. Her knowledge, maintained through reading and conversation with other mothers and the general accumulated wisdom of women managing families, was a genuine financial asset. The illnesses that did not require a doctor visit because she knew what she was dealing with and how to manage it, were illnesses that did not cost the household the visit fee. Across a year, across a family with 3 or 4 children, that adds up to real money. I want to mention something that appeared in several of the oral histories I have read from women of this era, something about the relationship between information and freedom that I think captures an important truth about how the household economics we have been discussing actually worked at the deepest level. She knew things, and she knew that knowing things mattered. This sounds obvious until you consider the official ideology she was operating within, which tended to frame household management as a matter of intuition, warmth, and love, rather than information and calculation. The good wife and mother was supposed to manage the house through a kind of natural feminine competence, not through deliberate strategy or the exercise of analytical intelligence, the very qualities that actually made her effective: the price tracking, the calendar management, the information gathering about insurance policies and medical conditions and market prices. These were qualities that the surrounding culture tended to be indifferent to, or occasionally actively dismissive of, because they were recognizably intellectual, and the intellectual domain was officially his. She knew better. She knew that the price book mattered. She knew that keeping track of the insurance policy terms mattered. She knew that understanding the mortgage mattered even if she could not hold the mortgage in her name. She treated the information domain of household management as seriously as she treated the physical domain, and she was right to do so, because the information domain is where the real financial management happened. The physical work, the cooking and cleaning and sewing, was visible. The cognitive work, the planning and tracking and anticipating and calculating, was invisible. But the invisible work was what made the visible work financially coherent. This is a distinction worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it is relevant beyond the 1950s and beyond the specific situation of these women. Every household economy, in every era, runs on two kinds of work: the physical work of acquiring, preparing, maintaining, and managing material things, and the cognitive work of tracking information, making decisions, planning ahead, managing relationships, anticipating needs and costs and opportunities. In the 1950s household, the woman typically did both kinds of work in full, while receiving credit for neither, and particularly not for the cognitive work, which was not considered work at all in the official framing. Understanding that both kinds of work have value, and that the cognitive work in particular is what determines the financial health of the household over time, is the insight that runs through every strategy we have discussed tonight. She did not do these things because someone told her they were valuable. She did them because she understood, in whatever terms were available to her in her particular time and place, that this was what it took to keep the household economically intact. She did not need anyone to tell her that her intelligence was capital. She operated as if it were, because that was simply the truth. Let me bring us back now to the kitchen where we started, to the linoleum floor and the percolator and the pale green refrigerator and the ceramic canister set on the counter. Behind the coffee canister, the small glass jar, the label soaked off, the glass wiped clean, the bills folded with the quiet precision of something handled carefully over a long time. She put $1 in this morning, same as last week, same as most weeks for the past several years. She is not sure exactly how much is in it right now, because she has not counted in a while. Maybe $60, maybe $75. She will count it at the end of the month when she does her regular accounting, the quiet private review of all her envelopes and savings that she conducts on the last Saturday afternoon of every month, while the children are out and he is reading the paper in the living room. It is not dramatic. There is no ceremony. She will take out the jar and the tin and the envelopes. She will count. She will note the totals in the small notebook that lives in the same drawer as the coupons and the church schedule. She will think about what is coming in the next few months, and what needs to be built toward, and what can comfortably stay where it is. Then she will put everything back, make a cup of coffee, and start thinking about what to make for dinner. She does not think of this as anything particularly special. She does not have a word for what she is doing in those quiet monthly accounting sessions. The formal financial term portfolio review would make her laugh if she heard it applied to a coffee tin and a set of envelopes. She thinks of it as keeping track, as knowing where things stand, as doing her job. But it is something more than that. It is the exercise of financial intelligence in the face of a system that denied her financial identity. It is the maintenance of agency in a space that the culture told her was not hers to occupy with agency. It is the long, patient, unglamorous, entirely private work of preparing for a future that she was building without anyone watching, without anyone keeping score, without any recognition that it was happening at all. In 1970, Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and the women of the emerging feminist movement were arguing loudly and publicly for women's right to financial equality, economic independence, legal recognition of their personhood separate from their husbands. They were right to argue for it. Those changes were necessary and long overdue, and their arrival made real differences in real lives. But in the kitchen, behind the coffee canister, a generation of women had already been living the argument for 20 years. They had been demonstrating, $1 at a time, that they understood money, that they could manage it, that they had financial intelligence and discipline and foresight that deserved institutional support rather than institutional barrier. The women who got bank accounts in their own names in the mid-1970s were not learning something new. They were finally getting tools appropriate for work they had already been doing for decades. There is a particular quality of attention that characterizes the strategies we have discussed tonight. It is patient rather than urgent. It is consistent rather than dramatic. It is long horizon rather than short term. It is interested in the small and the incremental and the reliably repeated rather than the spectacular. These are qualities that our culture tends to undervalue because they do not make a very exciting story in the conventional sense. The $1 a week going into the jar does not have the narrative shape of a bold financial move. It does not feel like strategy in the heroic sense. It feels like prudence, which is a virtue so quiet and so unglamorous that most of the literature on it seems apologetic. But prudence at scale, over time, is transformative. A household that exercised financial prudence consistently for 20 years arrived at middle age in a fundamentally different position than a household that did not, regardless of income. The research on this is now fairly clear, though it was not being studied or discussed in the 1950s. The financial behavior of the household manager, the person doing the daily work of managing food and clothing and household supplies, and the various small and medium expenses that constitute the largest share of most household budgets, is the primary determinant of household financial health for middle-income families. Not the income level, not the investment strategy, the daily management behavior. And in the 1950s household, that behavior was almost universally her domain. The systems she developed to manage that domain, the jars and the envelopes and the price books and the careful timing and the information management and the informal savings mechanisms and the quiet but real strategies for generating small supplementary income and avoiding unnecessary expense, these were not primitive or unsophisticated, simply because they were made of glass jars and folded bills rather than spreadsheets and brokerage accounts. They were the functional equivalent of formal financial management tools, adapted for the specific constraints and opportunities of her time and her situation. And they worked. They worked for the families that sustained them over the long run. They worked for the women who maintained them with the kind of quiet discipline that goes unremarked upon, precisely because it never fails dramatically. I want to leave you with one final image before we close tonight's story. It is not a dramatic image. It is not a turning point or a revelation. It is just a woman in a kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She has finished the breakfast dishes, the children are at school, he has gone to work. The house is quiet in the way that houses get quiet mid-morning, the productive quiet of a space that has been cleaned and organized and is now simply being. She pours herself a second cup of coffee, which she does not usually allow herself because coffee costs money. But it is Tuesday and she has had a good week financially, and the jar is in good shape. She stands at the counter and drinks the coffee slowly. She is looking out the kitchen window at the yard, but she is not really looking at the yard. She is doing the mental arithmetic that she does habitually, the running calculation of where the household stands this week, what came in, what went out, what still needs to come out, what is building in the envelopes, what is coming up that she needs to plan for. It takes maybe 5 minutes, this review, because she does it so regularly that the numbers stay fresh. She does not need to write anything down today. Everything is where it should be. She finishes the coffee. She rinses the cup. She turns to the morning's other tasks. She has a neighbor coming over at 10, and she wants to have the living room straightened and a plate of cookies out because they are going to talk about the church bazaar, and she wants to be a good hostess. The cookies are something she made with the last of the flour she bought in bulk at the end of last month, which cost her 30% less per cup than the same flour at the regular price. This is not a calculation she made consciously. It is simply how she shops now. how she has always shopped for as long as she can remember having a household to shop for. The neighbor will come, they will talk about the bazaar, she will find out, in the course of the conversation, what Mrs. Henderson's daughter is selling at her stall this year, and whether it would be worth putting in an order through the informal network that routes things between households before they reach the bazaar table, maybe something she needs, maybe something worth trading for. She does not think of this as strategy. She does not think of herself as running an informal economy. She thinks of herself as being a good neighbor, a careful homemaker, a woman doing her job with care and intelligence, which is exactly what she is, and which is, as it turns out, one of the most economically significant things that happens in any household, in any era. Small things done consistently over a long time. That is the whole secret. It fits behind the coffee canister. It holds about $70 right now, and it is building towards something she has not entirely named yet, but has been quietly preparing for, one careful dollar at a time, for longer than she can precisely remember. That is the story of the 1950s housewife and her money, not a dramatic story. Not a story about rebellion or revolution or spectacular acts of financial genius, just the story of intelligent, patient, disciplined women managing what they had with everything they were, building stability and security inside a system that did not officially recognize their right to do either, and doing it so quietly and so consistently that the history books barely noticed it was happening at all. But it was happening, in kitchens all over suburban America, behind coffee canisters and inside cookie tins, and at the back of sewing baskets, and in the folded pages of household account notebooks, and in the steady, reliable, year-over-year accumulation of small surpluses carefully maintained. It was happening every single day, and the American middle-class family of the post-war era, for all the external forces that shaped it, was built in no small part on the foundation of that daily, invisible, entirely unacknowledged work. She deserves to be remembered for it, not just as a wife and mother, not just as a period-appropriate domestic figure in a nostalgic postcard version of the past, but as what she actually was, a skilled manager operating with discipline and creativity under genuine constraints, building something real and lasting out of materials and opportunities that most people would have considered insufficient. Women in the 1950s were hiding money from their husbands, not in a dramatic way, not in a spy thriller way, in a patient, careful, deeply intelligent way that had been refined over generations and passed down from mother to daughter like a family recipe, which is to say without ever being written down in any form that left a historical record, and with the full understanding on both sides of the exchange that the knowledge was important and fragile, and not for everyone. I want to sit with that for a moment before we go further, because the phrase hiding money carries a certain charge to it. It sounds like betrayal, it sounds like deception, and I want to be careful about how we talk about this, because the reality is more complicated than either of those words suggests, and a lot more interesting than the charge makes it seem. These women were not by and large hiding money because they wanted to undermine their marriages. They were not hiding money out of malice or contempt or some secret agenda that ran counter to the life they had built. They were hiding money because the alternative was having no money at all. Because the law, in most of the United States in the early 1950s, did not give a married woman the right to her own bank account without her husband's permission. Because a married woman's wages, in states that still operated under variations of coverture doctrine, belonged legally to her husband. Because the financial system of the era was constructed on the assumption that the husband was the economic unit and the wife was the dependent, and that assumption was written into contracts and credit applications and banking procedures in ways that made independent financial existence genuinely impossible for most married women in most of America at that time. So they worked around it, and working around it, that quiet, patient, determined working around the edges of a system that excluded you, became one of the most sophisticated informal financial practices in 20th century American domestic life. Let us start at the very beginning. Let us start with how money moved through a household in 1950s America, because unless you understand the architecture of the problem, you cannot understand how elegant the solutions were. In the typical post-war household, and I am speaking here of the white middle-class suburban household that dominated the cultural imagination of the era, while acknowledging that this was not the only kind of household that existed, not by a long stretch. The husband worked outside the home for wages. He received a paycheck, usually weekly or bi-weekly, and that paycheck represented the household's income. When he came home on payday, one of several things might happen, depending on the household. In some houses, he handed the paycheck directly to his wife, who deposited it and managed the household accounts. In other houses, he deposited it himself and gave his wife an allowance, a weekly or monthly sum designated for household expenses. In others still, he paid the major bills himself and gave his wife a grocery allowance that she was expected to stretch to cover food, household supplies, and often the children's clothing and incidentals. And in some houses, the arrangement was looser and more chaotic, with money moving according to immediate need rather than any planned system, which created its own set of problems and its own strategies for navigating them. The allowance system was probably the most common. A woman received a set amount per week, maybe $15, maybe $25, maybe $40 in a more comfortable household. And with that amount she was expected to feed the family, keep the house clean, clothe the children adequately, maintain herself in a presentable way that reflected well on her husband's income and social standing, and occasionally participate in the social rituals of neighborhood and church and school that required small contributions and modest expenditures. She was expected to do all of this without asking for more money. Running out before the week ended and having to ask was considered a failure of management, and in some households it was treated as a moral failing, evidence of poor character or insufficient intelligence, rather than what it actually was, which was an arithmetic problem. The gap between what was allocated and what was needed was where everything interesting began. A woman who received $25 a week for groceries in 1952 was working with a real and specific constraint. Meat cost money, produce cost money, the canned goods and baking supplies and cleaning materials and personal hygiene products that made a household run cost money. $25 went somewhere between a little way and a long way, depending on the size of the family, the dietary preferences of the husband, the proximity of a decent grocery store, the availability of a garden in the backyard, and about 40 other variables that shifted week to week. Managing that $25 well required genuine skill and consistent effort, and a kind of ongoing low-level mental calculation that never entirely switched off. And the women who were good at it, who were really genuinely skilled at the household economy, often found ways to create small surpluses, not large ones, not dramatic ones, but consistent, accumulating small ones. 5 cents saved here, a quarter saved there. The end of the month and there was $1.50 left that did not need to be spent. And over time, those small surpluses added up. And the question of what to do with them, where to keep them, how to maintain them without losing them to the next week's unexpected expense, was a question women thought about seriously and solved creatively. The coffee canister, which we mentioned at the very beginning, was just one solution among dozens. Let me tell you about the others. The grocery receipt was the first and perhaps the most common tool in the whole system. Every woman who shopped in the 1950s received receipts. Some stores itemized them in detail, others were more general. The clever household manager learnt very quickly that the receipt was a negotiating document as much as it was a record. If the grocery budget was $25 and the receipt showed $23.50, the $2.50 left over did not necessarily need to go back into the household pool. It could go into a pocket, into an envelope, into the small fold of a pocketbook that the husband never looked into. It was not spent money, it was saved money, and saved money was virtuous money by the logic of any frugal household. The question of where the savings went was a separate matter. Some women kept a second, slightly altered version of the grocery list in their heads. The real cost of the groceries and the reported cost of the groceries were not always identical. This sounds dishonest, and by a strict accounting it was, but I want you to understand the context before you make a judgment. A woman who had no legal right to money of her own, who had no bank account in her own name, who could not sign a lease or open a credit account without her husband's permission, who would be left in a genuinely perilous financial position if her husband became ill or injured or simply walked out the door one day, which happened, it happened regularly, without the woman having any legal or financial recourse. That woman was doing what human beings have always done when the official system fails to provide for their basic security, She was creating an unofficial one, and the grocery receipt was a very small part of that unofficial system. There were other tools. The storeroom calculation was one of them. Buying in bulk when something went on sale and stockpiling it in the pantry or the basement was entirely respectable household management, the kind of thing that was praised in homemaking magazines and discussed approvingly at church socials. What was less discussed was the accounting dimension of it. If you bought 20 cans of tomatoes when they were on sale for 8 cents a can instead of 12 cents a can, you had effectively saved 80 cents. Those 80 cents existed somewhere in the abstract arithmetic of the household, but they did not exist as cash, which meant they did not exist in any form the husband would notice or ask about. And the next time the grocery budget was allocated, the tomatoes were already on the shelf, which meant the tomatoes portion of the budget could go somewhere else. It could go toward a need that had been waiting. It could go into the envelope at the back of the sewing basket. It could go into the fund that did not have a name yet but was building toward something. Canning was another version of the same thing. A woman who spent a long Saturday in September canning the tomatoes from the garden, or putting up peaches, or making enough strawberry jam to last through February, was not just being industrious and domestic in the way that the era celebrated. She was quietly removing a portion of next winter's food budget from the ledger entirely, and that removal was real money, even if it never passed through anyone's hands as cash. It was money she could redirect, not toward anything dramatic, toward the small cushion of financial independence that was the only security she had access to. The sewing basket was the physical hiding place that showed up most often in the accounts and memoirs and oral histories of women of this era, second only to the coffee canister. There is a reason for that. A sewing basket was ubiquitous in any 1950s household, usually large enough to contain a useful amount of cash folded into a handkerchief or tucked into a pincushion, and protected by two powerful forces. The first was the basket's domestic legitimacy. A sewing basket belonged to a woman's sphere of activity, and a husband had no reason to look into it. The second was the mild but real social barrier of doing so. Digging through a woman's sewing basket was an intimate, slightly strange act that crossed an invisible boundary of household property. The basket was hers, its contents were hers. Nobody was going to root through it looking for hidden resources. Women understood this instinctively, and they used it. The pincushion itself deserves a mention here, because the pincushion was actually a perfect small hiding place in a way that seems almost too convenient. The fabric body of a large pincushion could conceal folded bills completely. The pincushion sat in plain sight, was handled regularly for its stated purpose, and was entirely invisible as a storage location because nothing about its presence was out of place. A rolled bill inside a pincushion in a sewing basket in a house where every woman sewed was about as well hidden as anything could be in a domestic space that offered relatively few enclosed containers. Hat boxes were another favorite. The post-war era was still the era of hats, at least for formal occasions, and a woman with 3 or 4 hat boxes stacked in her closet or on a shelf in the spare bedroom was not an unusual sight. Hat boxes were large enough to contain an envelope. They were private enough that nobody would casually open them, and they shared the same social protection as the sewing basket. They belonged to the woman's domain, and a man rifling through his wife's hat boxes would have seemed bizarre and slightly inappropriate by the social norms of the era. Even to the man himself, the coat pocket was a simpler and more immediate solution. Winter coats, once stored for the season, went into the back of the closet until the following fall. A small amount of cash in the inside pocket of a stored winter coat was invisible from October to October and could be retrieved, added to, or used quietly without anyone being the wiser. Some women kept a small running amount in each seasonal coat, rotating and consolidating at the beginning and end of each season, so that the total picture of their reserves was always in their head, even as the physical locations shifted. The book was perhaps the most elegant hiding place, and I find it beautiful for reasons that go beyond the purely practical. A $50 bill folded inside the pages of a book, specifically a book that the husband was unlikely to read, which in many households was most of them, was completely invisible. Books were not searched. Books were not gone through. A household with a modest bookshelf represented dozens of potential hiding places, each one perfectly private, and for the woman who kept a larger personal library, the options multiplied considerably. Women's novels, which their husbands generally did not touch. Recipe books, which represented a domestic text so firmly in the woman's sphere that even the most suspicious husband would have had difficulty explaining why he was going through the pages. Religious texts, etiquette guides, the collected volumes of a book club, each one representing another private vault. There are accounts from this era of women who kept a folded bill at a specific page in a specific volume, and who could tell you, without consulting any record, exactly which book, exactly which page, exactly what denomination, and exactly when it had been placed there. This is not an unusual human capacity. It is the same capacity that allows a person to remember where they put their keys, expanded and applied to a more complex system of locations and amounts. Women who managed informal money reserves were often maintaining a precise mental ledger that would have been impressive in any accounting context. Which brings us to the larger question of mental accounting, because this is where the daily practice becomes genuinely interesting and surprisingly modern. Behavioral economists in the late 20th century developed a concept they called mental accounting, and what they meant by it was the way human beings tend to categorize money according to its source, its purpose, and its intended use, creating separate psychological accounts that are treated differently even when the money is technically fungible. You treat a tax refund differently than you treat your paycheck, even though a dollar is a dollar. You treat money you have already mentally allocated to groceries differently than money that has not been allocated yet, even though it all lives in the same bank account. The women we are talking about were doing mental accounting at a sophisticated level without any formal training in the concept, because the concept had not been named yet. They were managing multiple invisible accounts simultaneously. There was the household account, which was the official ledger, the allowance, the bills, the groceries, the known expenses, and then there were the unofficial accounts, each one carrying a specific purpose and governed by specific rules that the woman had developed and maintained herself. The emergency fund was the most fundamental unofficial account. Every woman who maintained any kind of reserve kept the clearest sense of this one. It was the money that existed for the moment when something went seriously wrong, when the husband was in an accident and could not work for 3 weeks, when the furnace broke in January, when the doctor's bill came in higher than expected and the official household account could not absorb it without a shortfall that would be visible and uncomfortable. The emergency fund was the account that meant you did not have to ask, that you could cover the crisis without revealing that it was a crisis, without giving anyone outside the household a window into the gap between appearances and reality. This fund was sacred. It was never the first place a woman went when she needed something. It was the last resort that made all the other risks manageable. Below the emergency fund there was usually what I would call the contingency layer. This was the money for the smaller unexpected things, the things that were not catastrophic but were not nothing either. The school clothes that wore out faster than expected, the birthday present for a child's classmate at a party that appeared with 2 weeks' notice, the unexpected church collection, the small repair that needed to happen before it became a large repair. The contingency layer was the first line of defense against the steady accumulation of small financial surprises that could erode a carefully maintained household budget if there was no cushion between them and the official allocation. And above the contingency layer, in the households where the reserve building had been going on long enough and consistently enough, there was something else, a third layer, the aspirational fund, the money that was building towards something, a new winter coat that the current budget did not have room for but that was genuinely needed, a piece of furniture that was not strictly necessary but that would last 20 years and represented a real improvement in the household's quality of life, a contribution to a child's education that the husband considered impossible but that the woman had quietly decided was not impossible if she was patient and consistent. The aspirational fund was the place where long-term thinking lived, the account that transformed a woman's position from one of pure management into one of genuine planning. Not every woman maintained all 3 layers. Some were working with reserves so small that the distinction between emergency and contingency collapsed into a single envelope behind the flour canister. But the mental structure was the same regardless of scale, and the women who operated it understood it clearly. Let me take you somewhere specific for a moment, because I think the abstract becomes much more real when we put it in a kitchen. It is 1953. We are in a house on a street in a suburb outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. The street is lined with nearly identical houses built in the last 5 years, all of them young enough that the trees in the yards are still small and the lawns still look slightly raw, the way new construction neighborhoods always look for the first decade, before the roots get deep and the branches spread properly. The woman who lives in the third house from the corner is 31 years old. She has been married for 8 years. She has 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. Her husband works at a manufacturing plant 40 minutes away and earns what is, by the standards of the time and the neighborhood, a decent but not abundant wage. He is not a bad man. He is, by the accounts we would use to assess such things, a good man, reliable, employed, not prone to violence or drinking or the other obvious threats that the era tended to produce. He is simply a man of his time, which means he controls the finances, hands his wife a grocery allowance on Friday evenings, and considers the household's economic management to be his domain in the broadest sense, even though he is at work for 60 of the household's waking hours each week. She has been building her reserve for 4 years. She started small, with a change left over from a grocery trip in the fall of 1949, 23 cents, which she tucked into the front pocket of a winter coat she rarely wore, and then spent 3 days thinking about before she moved it to a more permanent location. By 1953, she has accumulated just over $90. The $90 lives in 3 locations. Some is in the pincushion in her sewing basket, some is folded into the back pages of a recipe book on the kitchen shelf, and a small amount, about $12, is in an actual envelope that she keeps beneath the good tablecloth in the linen drawer of the dining room hutch, because the linen drawer is never opened except for company, and company only happens 4 or 5 times a year, which means the money rests undisturbed for months at a time. $90 in 1953 is roughly equivalent to $1,000 in today's terms, though the comparison is imperfect, and the relative importance of the sum depended enormously on context. In her context, it represents about 3.5 weeks of her household's total grocery budget. It is the equivalent of 2 months of the electricity bill. It is enough to cover a moderate medical emergency without having to involve her husband's knowledge of the crisis, which matters to her for reasons that are partly practical and partly emotional and probably partly impossible to articulate precisely. It is a cushion, it is a margin, it is the difference between being vulnerable and being not quite as vulnerable, which is the best she can do inside the system she is living in. She does not think of it as a betrayal. She thinks of it as being careful. Now, here is the thing about this that I want to stay with for a moment. This woman's financial behavior, the accumulation of small surpluses, the maintenance of a reserve, the distribution of that reserve across multiple locations to reduce risk and increase security, is not fundamentally different from what any sensible financial advisor would recommend today. Build an emergency fund, maintain a cushion, have money accessible that is not allocated to any immediate expense, diversify your storage, review regularly. The advice is the same. The difference is that in 1953, doing these perfectly reasonable and financially prudent things required her to hide them from the legal co-owner of her household's finances, because the system gave her no other option, which is worth sitting with. It is the kind of historical detail that seems small until you start turning it over and realize how large it actually is. Let me talk about the women who taught other women, because the reserve system did not spring up independently in each household. It was transmitted, not through books or magazines. You would not have found an article in Good Housekeeping in 1952 explaining how to hide grocery money from your husband. It was transmitted through the horizontal network of women talking to each other, which was the primary information channel of domestic life in the era, and which is, I think, one of the most underappreciated communication systems in American social history. The neighbor over the back fence, the sister-in-law at Sunday dinner, the older woman at church who had been running a household for 30 years and whose knowledge of domestic economy was the accumulated result of 3 decades of daily practice. The grocery store line, where women who were strangers would fall into conversation about prices and find themselves exchanging, in the most casual way, information about which store was running a sale on flour, and in a more coded way, about where a prudent woman might keep the savings from that flour purchase. The coding was important. Women did not often speak directly about hiding money from their husbands, because saying it out loud created a record and named a thing that was better unnamed. Instead, the conversation happened in a kind of sideways fashion. I always keep a little something for the household emergencies could mean many things, officially. My mother always kept her household accounts separate from the grocery money, was a way of introducing the concept without quite owning it. A woman needs to know where a few dollars are in case something comes up, was practically a philosophical statement about the nature of financial independence, wrapped in the polite language of domestic practicality. Younger women listened to older women. New brides, moving into their first houses, received this knowledge from their mothers-in-law or their own mothers, passed along in the week before the wedding or in the early months of the marriage when everything was being established and the patterns of the household were being set. Here is how you manage the grocery budget. Here is how you keep track of what you spend. Here is what you do when you have a little left over. The advice was embedded in perfectly acceptable homemaking guidance and could be read as simply good household management, which it was, while also being something more specific and more carefully considered than that. There was a regional dimension to this as well. Women in rural areas had different strategies than women in suburbs, both because rural households had different economic structures, more subsistence production, more barter and informal exchange, more irregular income from agricultural work, and because rural women had been operating in formal household economies for longer and with greater necessity than their suburban counterparts. The suburban housewife of the 1950s was in some ways a newcomer to the formal allowance system, having been brought into a more cash economy existence by the post-war migration to the suburbs, and she was adapting strategies that worked in a different kind of household to her new circumstances. A woman whose mother had grown up on a farm might have learned about the egg money, the income from selling surplus eggs from the backyard flock, that by long tradition and informal agreement was considered the woman's money in rural households even when all other household income belonged to the husband. The egg money tradition was one of the few formally acknowledged forms of female economic independence in rural American culture, and women carried the logic of it. The idea that there was money that was hers, derived from her labor and her management, into the suburban context even when there were no chickens and no eggs to sell. The coffee canister was in a sense the suburban egg money. The principle was the same even when the mechanism was entirely different. Let me tell you about something that shows up in the oral histories and memoirs of women of this era with enough regularity that it seems significant. Many women describe a specific moment of clarity, a moment when they understood that the small reserve they had been building was real and useful and not just a vague exercise in cautious living. And that moment of clarity almost always involved a crisis, not a catastrophic crisis as a rule. A manageable crisis, the kind that arrives without warning and requires a specific sum of money within a specific window of time and does not care about your budget cycle or your husband's paycheck schedule. The furnace dies in February, the car breaks down on a Tuesday in October, the child falls at school and needs a doctor visit, and the doctor requires payment that day. The washing machine floods the basement and a repair cannot wait, and the woman goes to where her reserve is. She counts it, and the amount there is sufficient, maybe just barely, maybe with some creative redistribution from the contingency layer to cover the gap. But it is there. She handles it. She pays the repairman or the doctor, or buys the part, and she does it without waiting for Friday, without asking anyone for permission, without making the crisis into a larger event than it needs to be. The furnace was broken and now it is fixed. The child is fine. The car runs. The basement is dry. And the feeling of that, the feeling of having been the one who could solve the problem, of having had the resource at the moment when it was needed, of having provided the cushion that meant the crisis stayed small, was the feeling that made the system worthwhile, that made all the careful accounting and the hidden envelopes and the folded bills in the pincushion mean something beyond their face value. It was competence. It was agency. In a decade and a system that offered women very little of either in the economic sphere, it was a form of power, quiet and invisible and entirely real. There is a woman in a recorded oral history project from the early 1990s who describes this moment. She was in her 70s when she gave the interview, which means she was a young housewife in the early 1950s, and she tells the story of the time her husband slipped on ice and broke his wrist badly enough that he could not work for 6 weeks. She says, and I am paraphrasing because she says it more simply than I would, that the money she had saved in the previous 4 years, which at that point amounted to something like $120, was what kept them from having to ask her husband's family for help, and that not having to ask for help was, to her, the most important thing, not because there was anything wrong with asking, but because it was theirs. It was her work, her reserve, her management that kept them standing on their own through those 6 weeks. I just kept the jar full, she says, and when we needed it, it was there. I want to hold that for a moment. Now let us talk about the ways this system became more sophisticated over time, because what I have described so far is the foundation, and the women who had been running their household reserves for years developed the system in interesting directions. One of the most common developments was what we might call the secondary market. Women in a neighborhood who are both managing household reserves and maintaining active networks of domestic exchange found that the two systems were compatible in ways that could be formalized quietly among people who trusted each other. Here is what I mean. A woman who had a surplus of canning jars and a neighbor who had a surplus of late-season tomatoes could exchange the two. That exchange happened outside the cash economy and therefore outside the official household budget. No money changed hands, no receipt was generated. No husband was informed or needed to approve the transaction. But both women ended up better supplied than they had been, and both women had, in a sense, converted surplus resources into useful goods without touching their reserve. The system extended to larger items. Women who sewed well and women who could not sew but had other skills made informal arrangements that moved goods and services horizontally between households. Baby clothes that a child had outgrown could go to a neighbor whose child was just the right size, and what came back in exchange might be help with a curtain project, or a share of the winter vegetable garden, or a few hours of childcare during a difficult week. These were not formal contracts. They were favors embedded in a social system that tracked them, carefully and without paperwork, and expected eventual reciprocity. The women who participated in these networks were in effect expanding their household economy beyond the cash budget their husbands had allocated through a parallel system of exchange that the cash budget never saw. This had another effect that I think is worth noting. It built relationships. The women who participated most actively in the exchange network were the women who had the densest social connections in the neighborhood, who knew the most people and were known and trusted by the most people, and who had established the longest track record of following through on informal obligations, and that social capital was itself a resource. A woman with a rich network of informal exchange relationships was more resilient than a woman who had more cash but fewer relationships, because the network could absorb shocks that cash alone could not. If the cash was exhausted, the relationships remained, and relationships could be converted, in various ways, into the specific kinds of help that a crisis required. The woman who had been helping her neighbor with childcare for 3 years could, in an emergency, call on that neighbor for help without it feeling like an imposition. The woman who had been contributing to the informal exchange network for a decade was embedded in something that would not abandon her when things went badly. This is social insurance, which is one of the oldest forms of human risk management, predating every financial product and formal institution. These women were doing it with the same sophistication and intentionality that village communities have always applied to it, adapted to the specific social environment of the post-war American suburb. Close your eyes now if you would like to. Let the kitchen go quiet. Let the percolator finish its work. The jar is where it always is, behind the coffee canister, doing what it always does, $1 at a time, every week, for as long as it takes.